I've never said how much this sweater costs.
Do you want a sweater worth more than $4,000 or not?
Of course I do.
All right. But I rest my case. I rest my case.
I own many,
Guilty.
but that's not the point.
Guilty on all charges. Conspicuous consumption. CPI the past 3 months, today was 6.8 year over year. It's the largest increase since 1982. We're getting back to the post-Jimmy Carter era. And when Reagan got in there, inherited that mess. September was 5.4, October 6.2, November 6.8, points up 0.6 or approximately 10% over October, 1.4% over September. And here's the chart for those of you watching on the YouTube channel. This all started in March of 2021. That was the first month where the CPI rose over 2%. And who was wrong on inflation? Well, the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, called it transitory numerous times over the past 2 years. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, in her Senate confirmation hearing in December of 2020, Yellen said she believed the Fed and Biden admin could take advantage of interest rates being near zero and spend more on stimulus. Economist Paul Krugman thought it was transitory in his op-ed, How Not to Panic About Inflation. That did not age well. Quote, "Are businesses actually starting to set prices and wages based on the expectation of high future inflation? If they aren't, and my bet is they won't be, then the lesson of 2010 to 2011 will remain, don't panic." My God, he could not have been more wrong. Who was right on inflation? Jamie Dimon in March. I would suspect there is a pretty good chance you're going to see rates going up, and people are starting to worry about that. The American public, specifically Gen Z, has been on top of this issue. 77% of Americans were either somewhere or somewhat or very concerned about inflation back in March. And Gen Z, people aged 18 to 24, had the highest rate of very concerned about inflation at 52%. Larry Summers also got this right. Sacks, what are your thoughts on inflation, which now seems acute and permanent?
Right. Well, it's definitely not transitory. Remember when it was at about 5.1% over the summer that the administration said, no big deal, this is transitory, don't panic. Then it went to 6.2, now it's 6.8, looks like it's headed to 7%. And the real problem here is that these guys, the administration, have not adjusted course in light of this data. What they've tried to do instead is now speciously claim that the same bills that they had written and conceived, the Build Back Better bill, somehow, even though it was conceived at a time that was really deflationary, that somehow this is going to fight inflation. They're essentially repurposing. They're just changing the arguments they're using as opposed to changing their legislative priorities. And just today, we got a report from CBO saying that this Build Back Better bill wasn't going to cost $2 trillion, like the administration said. It's going to cost $5 trillion and add $3 trillion to the deficit.
Over 10 years, correct?
Over 10 years, if those programs are not sunsetted. So there's a bunch of budgetary gimmicks that were put in the bill. Basically, a lot of the programs would sunset after 1 year or 3 year or 6 years. And so that's the only way they've gotten it to this, $1.9 trillion price tag. The reason why that's a gimmick is because once the programs are created, it will create a special interest or constituency who is now dependent on those programs, and no one's ever going to want to cut them. Milton Friedman famously said that there's nothing quite so permanent as a temporary government program. So that is the game that progressives are playing, is they're going to create the dependency, the constituency who, once they receive the program, is never going to want to give it up. And they're counting on the fact that these programs will not sunset, which means they will cost $5 trillion and it will add $3 trillion to the deficit. So, the problem is, it'd be one thing if we were in a deflationary environment, if the economy was in the tank, but these guys are continuing to pump more and more stimulus into an economy that has enough. And really, Larry Summers made this point all the way back in February. I think this is worth reading what he said. He said, there's a chance that macroeconomic stimulus on a scale closer to World War II levels than normal recession levels will set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation. He said this in February. Everyone in the administration dismissed him. All the liberal economists that you mentioned basically derided him. He turned out to be exactly right. And he was just saying this about the roughly $2 trillion they passed back in February for COVID stimulus. And, since then they passed $1.2 trillion for infrastructure. And now it's this another $5 trillion for Build Back Better. So, the real problem here is that they are not adjusting course in light of this data that keeps coming out that inflation is a bigger and bigger
So what's
problem.
the right thing to do in your mind, Sacks? And then we'll go to you, Chamath.
Elon said it, can this bill. We don't need it. This is not what Biden was elected to do. He was elected to provide normalcy, stop the chaos. And he never got a mandate for this kind of, whatever, $10 trillion of tax
we've
and
been
spend.
wanting to do an infrastructure bill for a long time, but we didn't. That was prior to pumping so much stimulus into the system.
If he had just done the infrastructure bill and not the Build Back Better, it would have been one thing. But this is basically the third hyper stimulatory bill that they've sought to pass. First, they did the COVID release bill at a time when really the economy didn't need that stimulus.
All right, and then just dovetailing this, and get Chamath involved in this, is the jobs report. November non-farm payrolls increased only 210. They expected it to be 573, so it's a big miss. However, kind of a mixed bag because there's over 11 million job openings, and we're now at 4.2% unemployment rate, which is the lowest, which is getting towards the pandemic lows. And this is like before the 2008 financial crisis. Chamath, how do you reconcile inflation along with this crazy, bizarre job situation where people will not go back to work, people are planning on resigning, there continues to be resignations, and there's too many job openings, and people are raising salaries and still can't hire people?
Well, I think we did a pretty good job of unpacking the Great Resignation. I think it was last pod. So, right? Remember, there are three structural issues at play in the jobs front. One is that you have this really meaningful under-immigration that's happened because of Trump. The second was you've had a big mismatch between the degreed classes in America and the jobs that they can have for what they think they should earn, meaning you go to school, you get into all this debt, you try to become a teacher or something, and then you realize you can make more at an Amazon warehouse. Crazy.
Strange.
And then the fourth is you have all these boomers with an enormous amount of savings, 30, 40, $50 trillion, who are pulling forward their retirement and also subsidizing their kids. You put it all together, there's less of an incentive to be in the job force unless you pay higher wages. Now, let's just put a pin in that for a second. I think the thing that Sacks talked about is really important, which is that we have to really figure out whether inflation is transitory or it's persistent and it's here. And I just want to bring up, Nick, I'll send you these the Twitter links to this, but Bill Ackman tweeted out these two things today, which is that if you...
Fan of the pod.
Brilliant investor, by the way. Great human being, brilliant investor. Two very specific things. He actually called out something that we also mentioned before, which is that CPI is horribly calculated and it's really imprecise. And if you unpack CPI, there's something...
Price Index.
The Consumer Price Index. There's something in there, a component of it, that's very important, which is called the owner's equivalent rent, right? How much can somebody basically charge rent to other people? The way that they calculate that, which is 30% of the 30% of the calculation, is they just survey a handful of people. The problem is you don't need to survey because the actual exact data is available from single-family rentals that report this number. So their survey showed basically a much, much smaller increase than what the actual increase is. And let me just give it. So the largest owners of nationwide single-family rentals are reporting a 17% year-over-year rent increase.
Wow.
The OER that was calculated, quote unquote, by survey in the CPI was 3.5%. If you flow that through, it means that core CPI actually went from 4.9% today to actually 9%. And the CPI print, which was 6.8%, was actually 10.1%. So it just goes to show you we have sources of data that the government is not in a position to collect or measure. We have horribly inaccurate econometric models that we use. You know that phrase sort of shit in, shit out. So unfortunately, you get very bad...
Garbage in, garbage out.
You get very bad, crappy data. And now all of a sudden we're printing numbers. We're supposed to make policy against those numbers, but the numbers that underlie this decision-making is fundamentally flawed, and it's flawed in the wrong direction.
Okay, let's bring Friedberg in. Friedberg, what do you think is happening here vis-a-vis also the creation of companies and entrepreneurship? Because one of the weird things that's occurring is we're starting to hit a record number of LLCs, S-Corps, C-Corps being created. it seems like a lot of people are becoming freelance nation. Hundreds of thousands of new companies during the pandemic were started.
That is probably one of many places where the water is flowing when you fill my cup and it shall overfloweth. I was talking to a guy this week who
Juicy
has
Smollett?
was not that
Jesse
that industry.
Smollett, no.
Yeah, was not that person.
Come on, Chamath.
Yeah.
Put the wine down.
No, let him drink
Go
the
ahead,
wine.
Friedberg.
And
He's drinking fast.
this guy has a multi-billion-dollar consumer credit portfolio in subprime, which means he's got a bunch of consumers owe him money that generally there's going to be a high default rate, and his
No comment.
not. And he said that this year the portfolio performed beyond like the 1 percentile of the model distribution of what they expected to happen. They had the yield on the portfolio be 40% higher than they thought it would be, because there's so much liquidity in the hands of individuals. And so I think, Jason, while you might make the argument that companies and jobs are being created, that is one of many places where you overflow a river and lots of streams start to flow. We're seeing asset bubbles everywhere in NFTs, in crypto, in startups, in new ideas, in home prices, in everything.
Sneakers.
Now, the problem with inflation is, it's a definition. We all use this term and we throw it about, but inflation is really the measure of price going up over a period of time. And generally, you want to have inflation of some amount that allows you to see economic growth and expansion, that allows you to fund the debt that you used to create that growth in the first place. And so without some sort of an inflationary pressure, which is the output of economic growth, you end up, being unable to meet your debt obligations. And then things get really ugly. And the system, as it was constructed, because most of these governments and systems like we have today are funded by debt. So, Stan Druckenmiller gave a good interview in Q2. He was kind of on a roadshow, sounding the alarm bells around what was going on. He was saying the market is not speaking right now because basically the Fed kept canceling the market signals with their interest rate policy. And by canceling those market signals, it seemed like we had a free-for-all at the government level to keep spending. And so I do think that these two are pretty interrelated. The fact that we've kept interest rates low have allowed policymakers to say, you know what, the cost of debt for this government is zero. We can do anything we want. Just like consumers are saying, we can do anything we want. We can buy anything we want. We can spend any way we want. And as a result, we're kind of seeing this, inflationary pressure persist. Now, the problem is if you then raise rates and you can't borrow that money and suddenly people have to start to pay that debt down without economic growth having occurred, the whole system goes bankrupt. So the challenge that the Fed has is how do we raise rates without triggering an economic recession? And if people have overspended and are over-levered once again, and rates go up, it's going to get really ugly really fast. And so this is a first derivative balancing act. There's no simple and easy solution, unfortunately. Meanwhile, technology is causing deflationary pressures, which is exactly, maybe what you don't want to see happen when you're trying to realize economic growth. And that's,
The other thing that we talked about is that the Fed basically changed the government changed the rules on the percentage, basically what qualifies as a conforming mortgage. Remember that? And so now that's basically at $1 million. And if you think about it, most Americans, 80 to 90% of their true underlying wealth is their home, to the extent that they've built, a positive net worth. And if you all of a sudden, push up the upper bound on what a conforming mortgage is to $1 million, that effectively means it's roughly about 20%. That effectively means that you're moving people's net worth up by about 4 or 5%.
That's right.
And so if they take that and then they take that money out of their home via a HELOC or an equity line of credit, right? Home equity line of credit. And then, to your point, Friedberg, they spend it or they invest it or they, it could be a real disaster scenario in 5 or 6 years' time.
By the way,
this is more like 1929 kind of crazy.
Yeah. By the way, if you go back remember when we were in the depths of the market collapsing and everything, when basically the economy shut down with lockdowns when COVID started. And I was speaking to a senior banker at that day, and he told me, look, it's pretty simple what's going to happen. The Fed's going to drop interest rates to zero and they're going to pump money into the system. because that's the only way you're going to be able to keep asset prices from collapsing. And we're going to artificially inflate asset prices. And we're going to do it for a long time, because then people look at the stock market and they say, oh my gosh, stocks are going up. Oh my gosh, revenue is going up. Everything gets inflated by pumping money into the system. And the problem is, while there's a perceived, you keep saying the home price goes up and I keep saying stocks go up, but the purchasing power that arises when the inflation is higher than what those things are going up at indicates economic recession underlying that inflationary bubble. And the circumstance needs to be analyzed, unfortunately, a little bit more deeper than that, which is it's not just about inflation. It's about, have we pumped enough money in to trigger economic growth that we can come to balance where the growth can outpace the inflation? And we're not there.
Well, superimposed on this
because like, think about it. Sorry, let me just say one simple analogy. Let's say I've got 50 clams, and there's suddenly a bunch of clams come into the clam market. Now I got 100 clams. And if the number of clams has gone up by 3x, my purchasing power has actually gone down by a third. While it might look like I've now got twice as many clams, I can only buy 1/3 as much as I could buy before, because there's so many more clams floating around. And that's the problem.
I love clams.
You love clams.
Clams casino, the big clams, or you like them just... All right, listen, I did a little bit of math. I've been watching the price to sales ratios of some of the top companies. We can pull this up on the screen. And the price to sales of companies, including Zoom, obviously was ridiculous. During the pandemic, that was a pandemic stock. So on top of all of this money being printed into the system, you had the participation of a bunch of stonk traders, and that whole movement buying up meme stocks or others. We had the price sales ratio of Zoom, in other words, the value of the enterprise versus their actual sales, was at 123. It's now at 14.7. Peloton was another one of those at 23, now down to 3x, down 87%. Coinbase, Square also, it drops off pretty significantly here. But you can also, we looked at the peak price to sales and how much larger it is then. And so some of these are now off 8x, 4x, and then it drops off to 2x, 1x. But it's quite I don't know if you guys are looking at the numbers or if you have any thoughts on this, but it seems like there was a mispricing of certain equities. And
it wasn't a mispricing. The Federal Reserve forced a lot of institutional investors to be out as long dated as possible in buying earnings. Because if you have to remember, it's not just that real rates were effectively zero, but if you wanted to own inflation-protected securities, it was actually a negative yield. So we were destroying people's savings. And there are a lot of institutions that must own some of these inflation-protected assets. So we were already in a negative yield environment. What are those folks supposed to do if they have to fund an 8% return a year to pay the pensions of good people, firefighters, teachers, it's, you name it, policemen, etc., right? They were forced to invest in the kinds of funds that would then go out further and further out into the future to buy the promise of future cash flows. And when all of a sudden a whole bunch of other assets that they held, which were supposed to be safe, implodes on them, right? Because all of a sudden inflation changes and the front end of the yield curve goes whoop, and all of a sudden all these assets, when yields go up, prices go down. Now the fireman's pension is like, oh my gosh, we just lost all this money we never thought we were going to lose. And we're long all these, crazy tech stocks. And so then they're forced to sell so that their overall exposure goes down. That's called degrossing, okay? And we've been going through a very painful process of this degrossing. Hedge funds are doing it in droves.
Can I ask you a question then, Chamath? I'm sorry to interrupt, but should they not have looked at these multiples and said, you know what? Maybe this one's out of whack and I should buy the ones that are not as out of whack, because this
not
to me
really,
seems...
Not really, because for the last 15 years, if you had, the problem with being a value investor over the last 15 years since 2008 is you were basically a dumpster diver. And you got paid absolutely, you didn't make anything because they misunderstood what value was. Value isn't necessarily things that are cheap. Value is things that are valuable. And over the last 15 or 20 years, what was once a question is now definitive, which is that the things that are valuable tend to be technological. because they're super high margin, they grow really quickly, they compound, they create enormous cash flows at scale. So
Agreed.
the point is you couldn't own that stuff. And if you sat on the sidelines, you weren't meeting your 8% hurdle. You were all of a sudden looking at some risk of defaulting on your pension obligations. So this is how this whole cycle brought us to today.
So there was nowhere, what you're saying is, if I can summarize, there was nowhere else for them to put their money. Sacks, price matters though. So is this just bad capital allocation? People weren't thinking about the entry price of their investments? We're giving too much credit?
Well, I think what happened is that you had a liquidity fueled boom going on. So what we've seen over the past 4 or 5 weeks, about the first week in November, the market basically peaked, and at least growth stocks did, and SaaS companies did. If you look kind of November 8th was sort of the beginning of the downturn. And since then, most of these growth stocks are down about 30% plus. Crypto is down now. I mean, it's sliding as we speak, 30, 40% off a peak around the same time. What happened around the first week in November? Well, you had 3 Fed governors come out and make very hawkish statements about the fact that the Fed was going to need to double the speed of its taper, and that you're going to have 2 to 3 rate increases next year. And so basically, we went from being in a low interest rate environment, which has been the case, not only just low interest rate environment, low interest rates with massive stimulus and pumping out of Washington by both the Fed and by Congress. Okay. And so you went from that environment to all of a sudden an environment of now we're expecting to have rate increases, and that's going to suck the liquidity out of the system. The amazing thing that I'm seeing right now is that every investor I know is having the same conversation. It doesn't matter whether you're a SaaS investor or a real estate investor or a crypto investor. They're all having the same conversation, which is, what are interest rates going to do? How much liquidity is that going to suck out of the system? And how much of the boom that we've experienced over the last couple of years has been because of this unnatural liquidity that's been pumped into the system? And so I've never seen it be the case that investors across every asset category are having that macro conversation as opposed to talking about like micro stuff, right? Like
the specific company, the earnings,
exactly.
The product, who they're beating, the market share.
Nobody's talking about that. Like, what building do I buy, or what SaaS company do I invest in? It's all about what is happening in the macro picture. And this is where I think what Biden is doing is so unbelievably off base is, okay, look, he didn't start $1 trillion deficits. That happened under the previous president. I'm not saying that was good, but now what we have is a situation here of the Fed is getting extremely hawkish, of tightening. We're seeing inflation now out of control, and yet there's been no adjustment whatsoever on a policy basis.
Yeah.
Can we just say
nobody's
the ugly
hitting
truth?
the brakes? Right.
Wait, let's just call a spade at this point, because I think we can. I think Biden is, and will ever be a really moderate, down the middle centrist. I don't think there's ever been an extreme bone in that man's body. He has always come off at, the word that I think when I've always thought of Biden, even now, is equanimity. The guy is a really down the middle person. He's not an extreme individual. I think that's the only kind of personality, by the way, that could have thrived for 8 years as a VP with Obama and had been in every room in every meeting. The problem, Sacks, and tell me if you think this is totally off base, is that there was a head fake after he won the presidency where there was this fake lurch to the progressive left. And it turned out that it was a complete head fake because that whole cohort of people just totally jumped the shark. Because all that rhetoric then unfortunately turned out to be not worth much. It started to blow up in their face in every single election that's happened since then, at the local level in cities, at the state level in places like Virginia. And in the middle of all of that, I actually think what happened was that faction tried to push an extremely aggressive legislative agenda to paint Biden as the next Roosevelt, which maybe he didn't even have the desire to be, because I think that he seems a very low ego kind of person. And now we're actually realizing, oh my gosh, this makes no sense. And so the part of why I think the markets are kind of like hand-wringing is you would expect at this point the federal bureaucracy to actually step in. But I think there's like a real lack of confidence because, for example, today, when there's a CPI print of somewhere between 7 and 10%, the only Democratic sounding, the talking point was one of the squad proposing a 4-day work week.
I mean,
right.
That is insane.
That's
guys,
like you're in crazy debt and you're like, you know what we should do?
Guys.
We should spend more money and work less.
When the CBO says we're about to go $3 more trillion into debt, the solution isn't to I actually think if you want to work less. You know, maybe you're lucky and your boomer parents can give you money, but there's a bunch of us like me who had to grind. I didn't have anybody to fall back on. And if you all of a sudden passed a law that said, hey, Chamath, you can only work 4 days a week, I would be really angry because you're depriving me of 20% more of a chance to beat all those other soft candy asses that went to all those fancy schools that weren't willing to work.
Yeah, ignore. That's the stupidest suggestion.
Let me work.
So I think this proposal that came out to basically this was a new proposal that they were going to limit the work week to 4 days a week. Wouldn't let people work 5 days a week. The reason why it's a bad idea in general, but it's a particularly sort of a brain dead idea to propose during sort of this inflationary period, because again, inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods. Well, so you have a demand component from the pumping and the stimulus, but you also have the supply component, which is we don't have enough goods and services. Why? Because we've been, passing out these stimmy checks that disincentivize people from working. We have problems with the ports. We have these COVID restrictions that have all gotten in the way.
Restaurants are closing 3 days a week because they can't find servers.
So we've had a shortage of goods and services. So the last thing we need is a 20% reduction in the number of work days and work hours that are available. So it just shows like how out of touch these progressives are. But look, to Chamath, to your point about Biden, I don't know, exactly what's in Biden's heart. To me, it doesn't really matter. I actually think he's pretty liberal. He's not all the way out to where, AOC is. Fine, fair enough. But look, at the end of the day, I think, this idea of Biden being a moderate, moderate is as moderate does. He has not governed like a moderate, whether that's because this moderate thing was just a marketing shtick on his part and he's actually more liberal, or whether he's been co-opted and taken over by the progressives. I don't really care what the reason is. The fact of the matter is he is not governed like a moderate.
At least we pull back the spend, David. I mean, the spend.
No, we have not pulled back the spend.
Well, no. The original bill was going to be 2 or 3 times.
We just we put the bullet in the chamber and loaded it for Manchin. This bill is not going to happen, David, with the $3 trillion deficit increase.
I hope not. I mean, but the point is that, if people like us don't speak up and say this is a reckless, foolish, crazy. Yes, exactly. Then
you can only fly the plane so fast before the wings come off. This is too much speed for the airframe. Let's go to a clip of our friend Elon.
This is a $5 trillion bill.
Let's go to this clip of Elon talking about capital allocation. It's like 30 seconds, and then Friedberg, I'd like you to comment on the other side. Let's go.
At a certain point, really what you're doing is capital allocation. So it's not money for personal expenditures. What you're doing is capital allocation. And it does not make sense to take the job of capital allocation away from people who have demonstrated great skill in capital allocation and give it to an entity that has demonstrated very poor skill in capital allocation, which is the government.
Yeah, Friedberg, your thoughts on Elon's?
I've said it in the past.
This was at a Wall Street Journal conference, by the way.
You can think of a government or a nonprofit or a corporation as an organism, as a living organism. And each living organism wants to eat and grow. And there is no such thing as an organism that says, over time, I want to shrink and shrivel away and die. So the organizing principle of the people in the government is to do more for their constituents, for their owners, which are what they believe to be the taxpayers or their the folks that elected them to office. The politicians themselves, I would argue, are more actors in the Ouija board of behavior that's going on here, and less kind of the mental designer of a system that they're trying to use to infiltrate change in the world individually and conquer and gain individual power. There may be some degree of motivation there, but I think largely it's more about the fact that that organism, that government, wants to grow, wants to spend more, wants to do more over time, not less. And this is true of any business. Every business wants to grow. If you're not growing, you're dying. And every nonprofit, there's no such thing as a nonprofit that says, let's not fundraise and let's spend all our money and then shut down. And so I just think as much as we want to kind of sit here and rationalize a way to better politicians that are going to better serve us, that are going to think smarter, The reality is every government, every institution of government in the history of humankind has tried to grow, and eventually they cycle back. The United States, like I said last year, maybe kind of going out with a little bit of a whimper, less of a bang, and that's going to be a function of the devaluation of currency, or having less of a place in the global stage, and so on. But I think Elon's right. He feels, and many people in business feel, like they're in competition with the government for capital. And that capital is the only difference is that the government can force that capital, can force that revenue, and no business can. And so they've got an unfair advantage in that stage of playing for capital. And this is where Bitcoin feels to a lot of people like a great equalizer. And I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist or anything, but I think that's where the appeal arises, which is, as Jefferson said, like every generation needs a revolution. And I think that this is the revolution that folks are looking for, which is how do we get this big monopolistic player off the playing field to let us do what we want to do?
Well, it's so easy. All Biden has to do is what he was elected to. He never had a mandate for this $10 trillion of spending. The guy ran a basement campaign. He was elected to not be Trump. Okay, he was elected to stop the chaos, not to engage this $10 trillion progressive agenda. Elon, I think, made a really good point about the capital allocation there. People think, okay, Elon's got all this money, so he must be enjoying this incredible lifestyle. Look, he's right that once you have that much money, you can't spend it all on personal consumption. You invest it. And so the question is, who's going to make that investment? Who's going to be better at it, Elon or the federal government? We know Elon is better at it. He creates incredible innovations. He's going to put people on Mars. He can do incredible things with that capital.
1 million
whereas the government
vehicles.
just squanders it. Elon had another really good. I think Elon actually understands economics at a macro level really well. He had a really good. There's an equally good snippet of him on the Rogan show, called the Horn of Plenty. Yeah, the Horn of Plenty, where he says, "Look, there's a lot of people out there who think the economy is just like this Horn of Plenty that produces all these goods, and the goods just magically appear no matter what we do." Okay, and so if some people have more goods than others, it's just because they stole them from the Horn of Plenty. What he said is, no, this is not the way the economy works. People actually have to make the stuff. If people don't make the stuff, there is no stuff. Okay, the stuff doesn't just magically appear. And the way the stuff gets made is you have people making smart capital allocation decisions and engaging in hard work, and that's what actually produces the stuff. And it's not a zero-sum game. So if you think about this agenda that we have in Washington, it really flips this on its head. It's doing everything it can to stop the production of the stuff, whether it's the stimmy checks or the COVID lockdowns or
bonus
or
unemployment, extending
or
just confiscating the earnings of people so that they can spend it on whatever they want.
Tax,
right,
whatever,
exactly. Yeah. It's actually putting constraints on the production, on the supply of the stuff, and then meanwhile, it's just printing all this money. So then we wonder, where does the inflation come from? Well, obviously, it's coming from printing more money for fewer goods. That's basically the problem with the agenda we have in Washington right now.
The increase in the deficit is just getting stunning. If you look back on the 5 or 6 last presidents, Reagan, 142% increase. He got us up to 1.42 trillion. He had to obviously combat what happened under Jimmy Carter. George H.W. Bush, 36% increase. President Bill Clinton, a 1% decrease. The first time we've had a surplus in a long time. And then Bush II, 57% increase.
No, the economic results under Bill Clinton were amazing. I've talked about it on the show before.
I was just about to say, he's a goat.
Yeah, but at the time, what was very interesting is politicians actually took this issue of balancing the budget very seriously.
Really seriously.
Deadly seriously, and thinking about how we would pay for things. And now we don't seem to think about who is going to pay for these things.
Yes.
Which is going to screw our children.
Okay, so you have to remember that Bill Clinton was the president who said the era of big government is over. And when he left office, he actually bragged about reducing the federal government's share of the economy from 22% to 18.5%. You would never hear a Democratic president.
It'll never happen again.
You'll never hear a Democratic president. Well, first of all, they wouldn't do it. But second, they wouldn't brag about it. You can't even say something like
they would
that.
Be ashamed at balancing.
Zach, let me ask you: do you think a Republican president would? Because I'm not convinced that any party matters at this point. It feels to me like the incentive structure is such that the individuals who are representing constituents who get them elected and they can pass more dollars back to those constituents drives a systemic model of growth for the government, and therefore the government is competing as a monopoly on the field for capital.
Yeah,
and
look, I think you got a point.
You thought Trump was going to be this guy, and Trump came in, and he ended up spending more. And I recognize there were extenuating circumstances and so on, but I thought he was going to go in. I thought the premise was blow up the government, cut all this nonsense, and the deficit kind of shot up.
You're right that Republicans have a very spotty record on government spending, and we did have $1 trillion deficits pre-COVID under Trump, and that was not good. But what Biden is doing now in the face of inflation is worse. And look, I mean, historically, the only times that you really have, it seems like fiscal responsibility is when you actually have the best track records have been when you have Democratic presidents or Republican Congresses, and the Republicans suddenly find their principles on spending when there's a Democrat in the White House. You're right that when Trump was in office and had Congress, and George W. Bush, had Congress, the Republicans spent a lot of money too. So it's absolutely a bipartisan problem. But what's happening now in Washington is under Biden is unprecedented. It is a breaking of the bank. They're talking about minting $1 trillion coins. So yes, it was a problem under Republicans, but this is even worse. And here's another thing is the Fed is now saying that they're projecting 2 to 3 rate increases next year. So let's call that 75 basis points. Multiply that by the close to 30 trillion of government debt that you're talking about, Jason. That's about 150 billion a year of interest payments on the debt of debt service. Okay, 150 billion
extra
that
and
doesn't exist today.
It's not fixed rate, by the way. That's right.
It's all short-term rates. It's all short-term rates because yes. So you're looking at 150 billion of incremental debt service costs, right? So multiply that over 10 years. That's 1.5 trillion over 10 years. That's your Build Back Better right there. Where is this money for Build Back Better going to come from when we have 1.5 trillion of increased interest rate costs starting next year?
And how do we get the cycle of people wanting to go back to work and be productive? It feels to me like this could be
raise wages,
which is what's happening, but people are still not going back to work. Have you been watching the people Jason, are offering $70,000 to be a manager of a Taco Bell, and people won't take the job?
Well, then you offer $75,000.
I still don't think they fill it.
No, I think that model's dead. I think low cost labor is inevitably
it's not low cost if they're making $75,000.
Well, I mean, I think in order for people to buy the function, I don't think labor, but it's high cost. I don't think Taco Bell is going to sell burritos if they cost $6. So if they're going to have to raise labor costs, people aren't going to be buying Taco Bell. They're going to go somewhere else. So the low cost model of consumerism in the United States, which has been a stronghold for our economy for 100 years at this point, may be coming to an end, or it will accelerate the implementation of automation across that sector of the economy.
Yeah, that's what's happening.
I think that's more likely.
That's more likely.
Yeah.
By the way, if you read the press release for the 4 days a week,
I'd pay $4 for a Taco Bell burrito though.
Gobbledygook, in the 4 days a week thing, it said workers for far too long have been forced to work very long hours and not get paid. And
wait, they were not paid?
And so the idea is just like, opt out, but then if you opt out, you'll make even less.
Yeah.
In a moment where you can actually make more.
Yeah.
These idiots who are coming up with these ideas.
The Chinese must be
licking
their chops at these buy-outs, wrecking the American economy.
Oh my God.
But in terms of,
they don't need to do anything. We're destroying it from the inside.
Yeah, exactly. So just in terms of what we should do here, I actually think there's a lot of strength in the economy right now. It's not all negative. I mean, the unemployment rate is down to 4.5%. The labor participation rate, it's quite low. I mean, it was 3.5% before COVID, so we're getting close to where we were before COVID. The labor participation rate's not great. I think it's like 61%.
Salaries
it was 63. It was 63% before COVID. So we need to get more people working. We could do that by ending the stimmy checks. Okay. But the most important thing we could do right now is Manchin would do Biden the biggest favor by just putting a bullet in this Build Back Better plan, because I actually think there'd be a massive relief rally and the economy would take off like a rocket next year if you just got government out of the way. They have printed enough. The best thing that could happen is they stop this pumping and stimulus, and then the Fed doesn't have to raise rates as aggressively next year. And we could let things have more of a soft landing as opposed to this sudden austerity, which is whipsawing the economy.
So just slow the plane down and then maybe break this bill into 20 component parts and just try to get a couple of things done.
He spent all the money. He spent all the money. It's spent.
I mean, this is a bender of all benders. And if people are refusing to go back to work, we're going to have to, we talked about this in the last episode, we're going to have to think about letting people immigrate.
Jason, I think it's a generalization to say people refuse to go back to work. I think the jobs that people had when their options open up to them, may not be jobs they want to go back to.
Correct. I agree.
I think that there's going to be a larger, significant growth in a services economy that didn't exist before. Think about how many yoga instructors there are today that didn't exist 20 years ago. How many, people doing
YouTube
hair,
creators,
the creator economy alone, right? Like Hollywood no longer has a monopoly on content, and people are spending more time consuming content than ever before. So, there's a services economy that I don't think we really predicted or modeled, and we all assume, oh my God, no one's going back to work. It's like, guess what? People are spending money, and they're going to spend money on new stuff, and these new industries are going to emerge. We know creators, and those creators are going to create jobs around them. One amazing creator will hire 100 people to staff his videos and make his music and edit his stuff and, run his business and so on. Like, it's just the way that the economy shifts. There's been a moment here that is like a Cambrian explosion of new species of industry, where, this meteorite of COVID came and hit planet Earth. There was an eradication of the old species, minimum wage jobs for crappy labor work that people don't want to do. And all of a sudden, the sun came out and new stuff is emerging and new life forms are emerging, new jobs are emerging. And I think we're going through a really ugly transitory period. But I think, like Sacks said, it could be really great on the other side. And there's also, there's one more argument to be made, which is our friend Brad Gerstner sent me a note today saying, I know you guys are going to rant on your all-in pod today about inflation. I want to remind you about the deflationary effect of technology, and it is really being felt in the economy. I think we all see it, how software alone can reduce the operating cost and the labor cost of businesses, drive up margins, increase growth. And so, there's a number of tailwinds here. But I think Sacks is right. There's a masking going on with respect to the capital that's just being bandied about right now. And it's a risky, nasty kind of, maelstrom of a sea we're trying to cross right now.
I want to point out two positive things to build on Sacks's positivity. Number one, I don't know if you guys are following Omicron in the UK. They have record cases right now, but deaths, and they're also done great with the vaccine, obviously. Small country with a lot of resources. So they're hitting record cases for this last cycle, but deaths and hospitalizations are down. And they say upward of 25, 50% is now moved to Omicron. And it seems like that this could be the end game, maybe. And
did you ever see the end of what was it, Outbreak, where they like dropped that bomb and it was like the massive bomb that takes all the air out of the room and like shocks everything, and then they're like, okay, it's over. There could be this thing happening where Omicron is the air bomb that gets dropped, clears the room, and then it's all over, Well, and then here's the other thing. We don't know.
I'm seeing the salaries going up faster than inflation. People are raising people's salaries, in double digits to try to get them to come to these jobs. So the people who are choosing to go back to work, and people are eventually choosing that and switching jobs, to Chamath's point, I think they're going to be making more money. And they're going to be more resilient, and they are going to be a little more empowered. And that could end up being a great thing. And then finally, in terms of technology, I have one robotic company that serves coffee, and they had a record week.
Pump it.
I'm not going to pump it, but I don't want to say the name.
Pump it.
No. They broke $11,000 in people ordering from a robotic coffee machine. Previously, the record was like $7,000 a week. So people are getting used.